Welcome to Review JU. We are here today with a very special episode to talk to you about the very long awaited and for a period of time imaginary Justice League Snyder Cut. And I'm saying that, don't kill me right away. We're going to get into the movie. We're going to get into the review. Spoiler free for this one, though we will be talking about some spoilery things over the next couple of weeks. And on Friday, in fact, you can join us right here on Fandom Entertainment, where we'll be watching along. We're going to bring in Spencer, Gilbert, and Danielle, and Lon, and Eric and I are going to pop on and off, and we're going to do a full-on watch party, so join us for that. But for today, spoiler-free review, and the reason I say it was imaginary is because actually pretty impressively, this is one of those circumstances in which the fans willed something into being. And this has happened a number of times. There's seasons of television that have been extended. Certainly famously, The Expanse was saved by fans sending drones to Amazon. But really, these were petitions and cries over a period of years, Eric, and it happened. We have the Snyder Cut of the Justice League. It's out there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like
right.
The truth.
It was 2014 when they first announced there would be Justice League has two movies, and then that plan changed, and then of course so much changed with the movie, and the release of Snyder Cut thing. It's pretty crazy. I read an interview with him in New York Times this weekend where he said what I had felt too, which is he's like, this doesn't happen without HBO Max, or it would have in 10 years they might have said let's put out a special edition Blu-ray, right? But it was a perfect storm, right, of HBO Max happening. Has this fan movement was happening, and they're like, hey, we want to have this new platform, we want to have something kind of big and bold on it, and it all came together. It's crazy that it did finally come together, and how much money they've spent on multiple revisions of this movie now between the theatrical version and the Snyder Cut version. But
Do you have an estimate on that, by the way? And this is something I was trying to do the math on this earlier today, and I think it's really important that we tease this out a little bit right now. So what you are going to see this Friday when it's released on HBO Max, Thursday night, pardon me, when it's released on HBO Max, the Snyder Cut is in fact very different than, Eric, what you just mentioned, which is a years on re-release or things like that. And the reason why I'm saying this is because there were multiple reshoots done years long. This is a different movie than what existed when the call for the Snyder Cut was first made. In other words, what the fans were initially asking to see was essentially an assembly cut of a movie where he had left it tragically. He had to leave to support his family unfinished. What we are seeing now is a fully realized film with the time and the space to think about filling in the gaps, and then the opportunity to your point, it kind of expensively reshoot in order to do that and tell the story he wanted to tell. So anyway, how much did it cost?
Well, they said whatever the original budget is, which I don't think if we know the exact, but probably in the $250 million range, because that's what these kind of movies cost. And then I think they said in recent reports, it was about 25 to 30 million for the Whedon directed reshoots that were in the theater. But then it was 70 million for this version, which only involved one major scene being shot.
And all of that's production, not marketing, right?
Right. Yeah. So they only came back and shot one major scene, but that's still 70 million in special effects, in finishing sequences that were never finished. And there's some things where I think they probably kind of brought things together that had been separate. So that's like basically between the two different versions, that's like an extra 100 million on the original budget. So this has to be one of the most expensive movies ever, even though I realized by saying that I'm talking about two completely different releases at this point. Right, still though, pretty crazy.
And then it's interesting how they're going to do the math on, like, I'm sure the bean counters are looking at the subscriptions for HBO Max that will potentially drive up as a result of this, and all of that math is being done. But certainly it is a big play for this service, for this streaming service that had a bumpy launch, let's be honest, has had a bumpy launch. So that's fairly impressive. They've had some controversy around saying just how many movies they're going to release on HBO Max versus theatrically. So, but let's dive in to this film. It's long awaited, as we've said. What's your take on this versus what we saw in the theaters? My one word is it makes a lot more sense. My three words is, how many words there's? It makes a lot more sense. Six words. A lot more sense. Six heroes, 6 words.
No, it to me, I mean, it's first and foremost, it is unequivocally better, which is what I expected and did hope, because that theatrical version is a hodgepodge of a movie that is two very conflicting filmmakers that, you know, and it's Warner Brothers saying, first of all, they were saying this has to be 2 hours. We know that was like a mandate that no, they had to be no more than 2 hours. And having, you know, Joss Whedon, who, you know, a lot of controversy going on with Joss Whedon lately, but I'll say as someone who's a fan of a lot of his work, he's so different than Zack Snyder. And to be like, hey, you take his movie and tweak it and add some jokes and lighten it up, but you're not going to reshoot like the majority of it. It just felt like a Frankenstein movie. When you're watching it, you feel that there's no unified vision. This has a unified vision. Zack Snyder has a very distinct vision, no matter what you think of that vision. So I think it is a better film for sure because it feels a whole. It feels like one unified piece. It feels like it is coming from a filmmaker who has a very distinct style, continuing what he wants to do, and is a more satisfying to watch in that regard. Even though I will say this is from a filmmaker whose approach to these DC characters is not my cup of tea, is not like the direction I really like for these characters or the feel I like for them. But I did watch the theatrical cut again last week, and I'm like, yeah, this is much better as far as just feeling like a continuation of the two films that he made prior to this.
Yeah, I would agree with you there. There's a couple of things. One, you're right. Joss Whedon's aesthetic is much more in line with Marvel's aesthetic. You know, I mean, he helped establish it. That's probably why, post Iron Man with the Avengers. So in this, I mean, like if you look again, whatever we think about Joss Whedon, the person, when we look at his work, it is doing a lot of what Marvel does. It's really funny. It's really irreverent. It's very satiric. He's taking tropes and he's playing with them. All of those things. It's often self-reflexive. All of these things that Marvel is. This, on the other hand, what we're seeing in this film. So it did. Justice League felt like a Frankenstein because that's not who Zack Snyder is, a filmmaker at all. This is, in fact, pure, uncut earnestness. Like if that would be my pull quote, like pure, uncut earnestness. It really does, and it's there is something to be said for that because I think that the people who enjoy him and enjoy his work and like his filmmaking will love this because it's very, very much a Zack Snyder film. Both aesthetically, there's like the desaturated color tones. There's fight sequences that use now well-trod kind of methods and tropes of his in terms of how he shoots fight sequences.
Lots of slow-mo.
Lots of slow motion character intros with rock songs accompanying them.
But
Really
slow, but like kind of like melancholy
slow versions of rock songs with slow motion to introduce character moments. Like all of that is there on display. But in addition to that, he's and I think to his credit, not backing away from himself, not backing away from his vision. He's fully owning it. And he, other than the Flash, he takes these characters very seriously. I think there's fans that really respond to that. They're very sad people a lot of the time. Like these are the dour moments of their lives a lot of the time. But there are moments of light, like I said, with the Flash, a little bit with Wonder Woman.
And a little bit with Aquaman.
But what it really has is like, he takes them seriously, so do the fans, and their relationships in this movie. We can talk about the villain later, but the relationship between the heroes is so much more established. I care so much more about them. There were a couple of them that really had gotten short shrift in the theatrical version because it was just clipping along and we didn't really understand anything about them. We do understand things about them here. And I feel like them coming together is earned, but I will debate you on the structure a little bit later. But what's sort of your take? What were your favorite? What do you think really worked?
I mean, I think what really works is, you know, the scope of it, and that he sees this as a very like epic mythic thing, and you definitely get that with the vibe, with the feel, with these sort of grand scenes, and because there is more time spent with things that we got glimpses of, and there's more time spent with the Amazons and more time spent with some of the Atlantean characters, and you get more of like this is a big world with these people that go back, you know, millennia, and that it really it's like, you know, they are the gods among us, which is like a big sort of feel that often the DC characters evoke, and you definitely get that like this is really on a grand scope, and you feel that a lot more, I think, than the theatrical cut. And there are definitely specifics on the characters. I mean, I think, yeah, Cyborg certainly has way more to do in this than the theatrical cut. He was the character, I think, that clearly
Yeah,
got his
totally.
storyline cut the most.
Yeah.
And there's a lot more sort of depth to him here. I don't know if it completely, I don't know if it's 100% successful as far as like, I don't know if I was like emotionally like, honed in. I wasn't like, getting like teary eyed about stuff, but I definitely appreciated getting more depth and just a more understanding where he's coming from. Right. Than in the theatrical version. It is like you said, it's like, this is unfiltered Snyder. And, I was going to say, we're not going to get into story spoilers, although the story is the story you saw in the theatrical version, but there's obviously some specific stuff we won't talk about just yet. But I think I can say this. The opening of this movie is showing you events you already saw from the end of Batman versus Superman again, but with a specific focus on Superman screaming in this sort of primal way that Snyder is honing in on. I chuckled a little because to me it becomes self-parody at points, how serious he takes this and how much he is like, they're great characters, but they're also like tragic, or like just like it's very like hard on sleeve in a kind of interesting way. But I think people who are into his stuff will love that opening. It's because it is just so like, this is what we're going for. Like, imagine hearing the screams of Superman. And it's grandiose. I guess that's the word I would really use about it. It's grandiose.
Yeah, it's grandiose.
Good or bad,
Good, exactly. I think, look, it's very clear that he, as a storyteller, is interested in like the Greeks and Odysseys and
Yes.
epic storytelling. And I think a lot of that, to your point, really lends itself to the DC characters and the way that they're created. They weren't as flawed and human in some senses
Right.
as the Marvel characters, which are meant to be us plus,
Yeah.
with all of our foibles and all of our struggles and things like that. So again, to fans, I think there's something really, really nice about that he's honoring that. I think for me, I tend to be more drawn to those human flaws and foibles. And here it's interesting because they certainly have a lot of pain,
Yes.
They do, but they're not necessarily within that pain making mistakes. And I think that's kind of maybe the difference, where they're in pain and yet always do the right thing. And I guess for me personally, I find that very unrelatable, because when I'm in pain, I inevitably do the wrong thing.
It keeps me at arm's length from it,
Yeah.
right? Like I'm more of like a witness than like invested in, like, again, it's like, it's hard not to bring up the Marvel movies, but it's like, where like the Marvel movies have like gotten to the point where it's like, oh man, look at like Steve and Tony having this argument. Like these movies keep you at more of a distance, where it's like, I'm never like Clark and Bruce, like, it's like, it's Superman and Batman in all of the sort of majesty of that. And that's like the function, that's like the level it's operating at. It's like, these are majestic characters, but it's harder to relate to them as like, just like, people that are doing their thing. And I don't think I don't even think that's the approach he wants you to connect to it at,
No, and there is something to that, like, again, just taking this movie for what it is. That's what it wants you to do. It wants you, even in the sense of like the most human aspect of Superman / Clark is his relationship with Lois. That is epic. That is also really epic, and larger than life, and larger certainly than most relationships. But that's okay. And I think actually, there's something great about that these characters can be that, and these archetypes, in the way that we don't see often anymore in movies. I think we used to see that a lot more. We used to see kind of like wish fulfillment characters, and we still see that, but they're usually very relatable. So it kind of harkens back to an old style of filmmaking in a way.
Yeah.
But with that in mind, there are some things that I would have done differently. Not as the filmmaker, I'm not putting myself in that position, literally, like as the distributor.
Yeah.
And here's where I want to talk the structure. And I know a lot of people are going to get infuriated about this, but see the movie first and then see what you think. Not because it's my preferred method of release, but because the filmmaker has structured it this way. I do not think it should have been released as one piece. It is very much structured. This isn't a spoiler, but there's chapter markers, right? Like, that's really not a spoiler. and they feel like episodic breaks. And it feels to me like at a certain point they were set up that way as an episodic break, and because there's beats in these different chapters that then repeat in other chapters, which would work in a television show, because in a television show in a given episode you can have a crescendo, you know what I mean, you can have a big epic battle, or you can have that moment and then come back the next week and have another one and a different one and a different sort of second set of circumstances, or a different look, or a different character arc within that episode. When it's one movie, it feels like multiple endings. And it feels like repeated beats, you know, repeated hero moments and things like that. And by the way, this is a movie about heroes. There are going to be hero moments. I mean something very specific about by that. And like all of those things to me weakened what it could have been had it been released the way I believe that the filmmaker slash creators actually structured it to be released and um, to be seen. Even if you were binging it, you kind of like mentally break, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I will say I felt those 4 hours, and I'm not, against long movies. And there's a lot of 3 hour movies I've loved, and 3.5 hour movies I loved, and maybe 4 hours is kind of pushing to the threshold. But it doesn't mean like there's no way I can love a 4 hour movie. But yeah, the way this is structured, the way certain things happen, I definitely felt those 4 hours, and not in a great way. And I think it's like he's mentioned how when he's putting the fact that he's putting back a lot of the Cyborg storyline, he's like, hey, Cyborg is the heart of this movie, and I can see why he would say that. Cyborg certainly has kind of a lot of emotional sort of meat of the story here. Cyborg also doesn't speak until 47 minutes into this film because it's very drawn out, and it's like it takes a couple of hours to bring this team together. The 2 hour length of the theatrical cut, which I absolutely think was truncated to a ridiculous degree and should never have been told they have to make it a tight 2 hours. But the fact that it takes them basically that length to even all be in the same room, you feel it. Like it's to the point that I think I agree with you, Roth. Like it might have benefited at that point if this was going to be the and the kitchen sink version, which it obviously ended up being. Then maybe you should release it episodically, because you start to be like much more counting the minutes of like, oh wow, this hasn't happened yet. That character's never spoken to that character yet. I know it's coming eventually. That when you watch it as a 4 hour movie, and I understand when you're at home, you can do whatever you want. Like you can pause, you can come back, but they are still presenting it as a movie. And on those terms, I think it definitely is weakened by being so long and feeling like, that, yeah, a lot of things are kind of no flash pun intended, but running in place a little bit until they get to these sort of big moments you're waiting for.
yeah, and I think and it's interesting because I would argue that the individual scenes are paced well, you know, for the most part. I think there is a very long scream at the top, but you
Right.
know, but largely, but it's more for me, it's like the cyclical nature of it where I would be fine with that if it was broken up that way. It's like there's a point where it's like this is the end of this movie, you know, this is
Hmm.
the big third act moment, and it's absolutely nowhere near done. And
Yeah.
then there's more of that, right? Then it shouldn't be released all as one piece. Is my take. It's really really I think a flaw of the way Warner Brothers has released the movie, and I don't think um it's not going to create the kind of audience and experience that you could have had with a different release structure.
Yeah, you feel it when it's like Aquaman swims away twice to like a sad song, and it's like, oh, we're kind of feeling this again, that like we experienced this already. If you're watching it in one sitting, which I think most people try to do because it's presented as one movie, you'll definitely feel that.
Yeah. So the other thing that I think is, and this is interesting, we've said these characters are large, they're archetypal, and there's something to that, and they're designed that way. But the villain makes way more sense and is given more screen time in this film. And I think in that sense is much more clear and so works better. However, remains, even with all of that added screen time, remains very, very arch,
Yeah.
very two-dimensional, and candidly, just like often stands around chatting about the evil thing he's going to do next. I
Yeah.
mean, like, take a drink don't do that because I'm not telling you to drink alcohol, but like, it's just like that's often what he's doing, and it doesn't lend itself to a very compelling foe.
No, yeah, and I think he's a very dull villain, and yes, He is more nuanced in the theatrical cut. We understand a little bit more about where he's coming from. And, again, not a spoiler because it's been talked about in real images and footage. Darkseid is now in this movie. He wasn't in the theatrical cut, but because Steppenwolf, our main villain, is reporting to Darkseid. And so there are too many reporting to Darkseid or reporting to someone else who works for Darkseid.
There's
and
middlemen.
Desaad, yeah. It's like there's just a lot of like, and because Steppenwolf himself is not an interesting character, even though we understand his motivation here more for sure, it's not like we're like, oh, he's intriguing or he's a cool villain. He looks more imposing in this version, and they make him more sort of like scary in a fight. But he's not an interesting character, and we spend a lot of time with him, having conversations and doing stuff, and it never really holds because you're not really engaged by who Steppenwolf is as a villain.
There's a lot of exposition. Yes. There is a lot of exposition, and it's really actually interesting to me because at a certain point I started to try and track it, where I was like, for someone that is such a visual filmmaker and that really like has created and owned and adopted his own visual language, when you are watching a Zack Snyder film, that you are 100%, there can be no doubt. He also relies really heavily on exposition. And I find that interesting, like to the point of like standing there and delivering an exposition.
Yeah. Bruce has a lot of that, and Diana has a lot of that.
That's a lot.
Yeah, Diana, I wish had more. And maybe he felt, because this movie was always supposed to open, which it did, the version we saw, it opened right after her solo movie. But even with everyone even with this expanded version, like she's not given a lot of interesting character stuff. She's used it a lot as an exposition in this movie. And it's just kind of like, there is a bit of come on, can we move faster on this, or is there a way to convey this message without someone kind of having to be like, here's what's happening and here's what we're doing.
And the truth is, like, there's points in films that you just can't get away with it. Exposition has to happen because the audience needs to understand something, and this is just how you need to get to it, But if you look at, again, it's not about comparing films, but I'm about to, a film that I love, which is Fury Road. It just doesn't rely on that at all. Like, it is the example of show not tell. I mean, so much so. It is one of the most cinematic movies I've ever seen in that sense. And I think I happen to adore that movie. I mean, but there's probably a fine balance to be had when there is a fair bit of information. It's just like, it's really relying on it. So that said, the villain is given more time, and I think is a lot more clear. And doesn't feel as like chopped up and diluted as in the theatrical cut. And to your point, this movie works a ton better overall than that one did. Those are really my main gripes. It's like, either I just think where it lands is, if you like Zack Snyder and you liked this story but felt that it was lacking in the theatrical cut, you're going to be extremely happy. You got exactly what you wanted. It is 100% a Zack Snyder film. There's way more character time. It's much more clear. Like, this is going to be a great movie for you if you love the way that he deals with these characters. If you don't, it's going to be 4 very long hours.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I agree. And I also think it's kind of to me, it's almost like this sort of fascinating curiosity or experiment almost, because watching it, I thought, there's more of his footage in the theatrical cut than some reports have made it seem of late. I think the more people wanted to see this version, the more it became like less and less of his footage, like in the telling of it. It's like, it became like, oh, 2/3 of that movie is his footage. Then it became half. Now it became like 20 minutes. There's a considerable amount of his movie that was in the theatrical cut that you'll see here. But it really shows you, almost in like a film school interesting way, how color correction, editing, and music choices can drastically change the feel of something, because it plays very differently. So I thought that was it's an interesting experiment almost in that regard. I think if you were someone like me who just was not into what Man of Steel and Batman versus Superman were doing with this world and these characters, has love for these characters, but this just was not what I liked about them or the vision I saw for them, I don't think this movie is going to change a lot of minds and be like, oh, now I'm on board. But if you were into that, and clearly there are people very passionately into it, yes, it's like it will very much deliver that. I think it is better than Batman. I really didn't like Batman versus Superman. I think it is better than Batman versus Superman, and there's more to kind of enjoy about it. It's still just, it's a take on these characters in this world that I just feel like this, like I said, that distance from, and it can't this version can't change that for me. but it is this sort of strange curiosity that it exists at all. And because we have that theatrical version, it is kind of like just a interesting thing to look at as a comparison that we can have both on HBO Max right now.
Yeah, 100%, because I think when you're looking at the theatrical version, you're gonna be looking at a lot of things. You're gonna be looking at a movie studio fighting for a release deadline,
Mhm.
and
Yes.
incomplete effects as a result, like we know about Baby Mouth,
Mhm.
and you're a studio a really sad event that
Yeah.
happened
Yeah.
that caused the director to leave a film, and they replaced him with a director who was aesthetically almost his opposite.
Mhm.
And that didn't work at all because Whedon wasn't able to make the Justice League he likely would have made, you
Right.
know?
If he'd been hired to make a Justice League movie, that would have been a
Yeah.
very different animal. Instead, you get this hybrid that serves not, doesn't make
Doesn't
anyone
serve
happy.
either of their visions and
Yeah.
doesn't serve the audience at all. And so in this one, it's a much like this is a better experience for the creators and for us. And I also think it just feels like he didn't have that much studio interference in terms of like he had so much room to tell the story, so he could get more information in there.
Yeah, I mean that's the weird thing is that things that I definitely criticize about this movie at this I'm almost like, but why not? Because the whole idea is to restore his vision. So I don't think it should be 4 hours.
Mhm.
The aspect ratio being that square box for because it was
Doesn't make a ton of
IMAX
sense for the actual release, which
doesn't make sense
isn't
for the
on
ton of
IMAX. Yeah.
right, right. But and I also I had a real problem. I won't get into spoilers here, but like the things he's talked about how he teases things for sequels he'll probably not make, but you never know. And there are things there where I'm like, I don't really love that choice or why we're getting a couple different teases here. But at the end of the day, if the idea was this is Zack Snyder's vision, even though it's not the movie we ever would have gotten in theaters because Warner Bros. Was never going to release a 4 hour version of this movie. Why not? Like this was his chance. So for him and his fans that wanted this so badly, might as well be the kitchen sink version because that's kind of the point of it even existing in the first place, right?
I couldn't agree with you more. And that's the other thing to note is that the movie that fans are going to see, I'm really glad they're getting it. Honestly, like I think about things like the Blade Runner and getting the actual director's vision, what a different movie that is, and how happy I am that I have that movie in my
Right.
life. Like I think people are going to feel that way about this, but your point is very well taken, and people should remember you never would have seen this in the theater. It would have he would have been made to bring it down at least to 2.5 hours, if not
Yep.
2 hours in a theatrical release. So it's awesome that they're getting it. But I will say the fragmented, as much as I believe this is much more cohesive and clear, other than that structure, which feels more episodic to me, the fragmented part is the part that's teasing anything else. And it's a very odd to me because I'm like, oh, to some degree, Eric, unlike you, there was one of them where I was like, all right, go on,
Right. Right. Right.
and I don't think I'll ever get a go on. I'll never get the
Right.
continuation of
Right.
that sentence. So I don't totally know why it's there. But that's for spoiler talk next week. In the interim, I hope you guys, if you've wanted the Snyder Cut and if you've been petitioning to it, first of all, thanks for still listening to us and engaging in a healthy conversation and debate about movies. If you didn't want it, then and you're just curious, yeah, satiate your curiosity, but bring snacks like and a bathroom and maybe your laundry to fold. You can get a lot done.
Or yeah, you can use that chapter break and be like, okay, chapter 5 is beginning. Maybe I'll take a little walk and come back and then watch chapter
Or
5.
you could even you could use the chapter breaks and do it just, come in the next day.
That's true. That's true as well. That's true.
I mean, they're there for you. It's like really clear.
It's very clear. Yes.
They are built in for you. All right. Thank you guys for joining us today. Please, please, please look. I'm gonna have a very honest moment. And like we've had a lot of trauma around DC like fans getting mad at us over the years. So I'm half begging you, like, let's just be reasonable. It's just a review, it's just our opinion. It's okay. We can all chat about it. You can have a different opinion. I'm glad you have the Snyder Cut. I love you. You're amazing. You're beautiful. Oh, that's it.
What she said.